Well, hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. This is Mike Steckline, partner with the Institute for Enterprise Excellence. I decided to insert a updated webinar, something that I hadn't planned, but I don't think in this day and age and what we're living for, I think people are doing a lot of stuff that they didn't plan on. So what I've got on this slide that you see in front of you here is some bit.ly links to previous webinars, including the one that I did last month on complexity. I call it Complexity 1, and was rather ambitious as far as putting together materials, and I wanted to review some of the things I talked about last time and some of us on the webinar discussed, and also talk about some new stuff that I didn't get to yet. And I see this potentially being an ongoing dialogue, something that can't necessarily be unpacked one at a time, but also given the change in our world and what people are coping with, it could also be something that could be an interactive check-in opportunity for people. So in that spirit, what I'd like to do, and I have unmuted the phones. I guess I should go to that slide first. So the phones are unmuted, so anybody that wants to participate and talk and discuss as we go through this, please feel free to do so. You can also put any comments or questions in the chat function, and this is going to be recorded so people can take advantage of the materials that are being shared and will be distributed accordingly. I want to go back to that previous slide. So one thing I put out here is, and my hunch is this is probably true for you folks as well, is people are finding helpful resources that are helping them to think through what's going on, how to cope with it. And I made some bit.ly links to some things that were of particular interest to me, and in the spirit of sharing it. So the first bit.ly link comes from a nice podcast that is called the Happiness Lab, but they're doing a special series on coping with the COVID-19. And so I really like that, and has some really good examples there. Sam Harris has a nice podcast, and he did one on meditation in an emergency that I really like. The bit.ly link on that says GV, that's Gaping Void Leadership, and that's their image there. They do illustrations and cartoons to make points. They've got an ebook, electronic book that is available for people that I think has some really great information. And I also enjoy listening to the podcast from Parit Barara, and he had a nice recent message that I thought was helpful and encouraging. So I put that out there, and just added some comments at the bottom if I could think of, what are some guiding heuristics or rules of thumb that might be helpful. In addition to wash your hands, keep your distance. But I added some at the bottom as far as be kind, go slow, stay safe, and think of others. And what I'd like to do before I move on to the materials I plan to share is see if anyone else that's on the call or webinar has found any beneficial resources for helping yourself or others to cope through this time period that you'd like to share, and then I'll put them up on the recording when it goes out. So I'm going to pause and see what other helpful materials people have found beneficial for themselves. Or things.
This is Dirk.
Go ahead, Dirk.
The Holy Bible.
Okay, all right. Have you found, Dirk, any, I know we were talking before the recording started, but you've made some decisions to relocate and also take on a new position. And of course, this is all one change on top of everything else. And so have you, in addition to, reading and referencing the Bible, have you found any things that helps you maintain your wits about you, or your sanity?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So as you can imagine, for those of you in the call that don't know me, as Mike mentioned, I'm transitioning not just into a new job with new responsibilities, new direct reports, and so forth. I'm also moving across the country to make that possible, and I'm separated right now from my wife. She's back home. I'm in another city. So that kind of plays in the background, just trying to get up to speed in a new role, international travel, coming back just before the lockdown with the COVID-19 occurred, etc. Then figuring out how to connect with my new team and all my new peers and my boss, not face to face, but in a remote context. So that's kind of the backdrop. So other than having that quiet time and contemplating, praying, and reading scripture, plan the day, have a plan for the day, and then set limitations for yourself. Take breaks. I struggle with that, and I get glued onto the computer, and I just work through. So I need to force myself to take breaks, cook myself lunch, and then I've now scheduled a walk or a bike ride at the end of each day, weather permitting. So I'll get out there for an hour, get some sunshine and some fresh air to get away from things completely.
Great advice. Appreciate that, Dirk. Anyone else sharing any advice or perspectives that they have found to be useful? I'll just say one more thing on this. I participated in a webinar with Cognitive Edge yesterday, and they're doing a lot of stuff to help people navigate through this time. And if I'm able to share the link to the recording to that webinar yesterday, I think you'll find it to be very beneficial. I don't know yet if I'll be able to share it publicly. My sense is I will be, but very, very good stuff. And a lot of the materials that I'm sharing is from their company. And I do so in the spirit of pointing people in the direction of things that I've found to be useful, and hopefully others find it to be useful as well. And I'll just say one more thing in the spirit of checking in. After we're done with this recording, we'll do it for the hour that's scheduled, but I'll stay on if anyone else wants to just chat or kibitz a bit while we're making it through the day. That part won't be recorded, but if anybody wants to hang out and talk a little bit more, I'll stay on the line until people move on to other things they got to do. So just a summary of things that were discussed last time. So these are small images from the webinar last time, but I just want to do a reset. One of the things I discussed was the thing that we've noticed as far as people falling into this flavor of the month trap, and all these different fads and things that come along that holds great promise that people latch onto, and why they fall short and why they don't work. And on that curve, things such as lean or lean sigma, and I added the notion of design thinking is something that is you see in the popular literature. Depending upon the source and the material, it could also help, cause people to fall into that trap. Now, there was a nice blog post from several years ago by Dave Snowden that he talked about the linkage between these concepts of complexity and lean. And if you go to that bit.ly link, you'll be able to read what Dave had to say about it. And I found it to be very interesting. So that was one thing I covered last time. I talked about the difference between models, what models are. All models are wrong and some are useful. And also, what is a framework? Because a big part of what I've been learning about is the Cynefin Sense-Making framework. Is not a model, but it's a way to view reality from different viewpoints. And so I unpacked that a bit. I also described that what I wanted to focus on, we identify principles of enterprise excellence that are principles that help companies stay in business. And what I purposely focused on was three of them. Embrace science. I cut off embrace scientific thinking, but thinking in terms of embracing science. And also respect every individual, respect humanity I shortened it there to understand how humans really process information and how humans really work. And then also with think systemically, and just started trying to describe how complexity thinking and really understand that the different types of thinking is not the same as the more popular systems thinking that perhaps people have been exposed to over the years. Now, this is a busy picture here, but one of the things I did last time was I went through two by two matrices that Dave Snowden and the group at Cognitive Edge have put together just to explain in the world of understanding complexity and coping with complexity and understanding the differences between the types of systems and problems we have. It really is quite different than some other things that have been proposed, some different approaches, and made that distinction. Also made a connection between anthrocomplexity, which is what a lot of this is about, understanding complexity and how to cope with complexity, actually has a lot of similarities to scientific management that was um, popular in or being explored in the early 1900s. And then this two by two matrix just showing that when people want to try to scale ideas, you have an idea of something that works and you want to try it in a small scale and then try to scale it larger, why some things scale and some things don't, and to make a distinction between classical science, case-based approaches, which have some use and they're very common in, of course, business literature and improvement literature, but there is a limitation because they cannot help to predict. And then also the caution to avoid flash in the pan, quick and easy shortcuts, the wishful thinking of the fads that come along. And so made that distinction. And then I shared the materials that I have with what I've been learning around better understanding complexity and how to cope with it, and pointing people to the work of Dave Snowden, who he is, the Cognitive Edge website and materials. So I included that last time. And then I did some unpacking of the Cynefin Sense-Making framework, and I'm going to be going over that a bit more on this webinar today, but I did some unpacking just to try to explain it and give people some understanding of how that is making sense. And then I connected something that was introduced by a friend and colleague, Dr. Paul Deschamps, at a previous webinar, and this was just the time when the COVID-19 was coming into play. And the purpose of his webinar was to talk about preventing provider burnout. And so I talked about that. And some of the things that we talked about there is a lot of different things that are constraints that we over-constrain the system and cause people to fall into chaos. And I think that's part of what we're experiencing. And then the final thing I tried to convey was, we have this model of trying to help people to work toward a common purpose, to understand different principles and understand the kind of behaviors that show up when people manage according to different principles, and the relationship between those behaviors and the kinds of results they're trying to achieve. And what I tried to point out with this was that in an earlier version of our model, between the KBIs or the behaviors and the KPIs, we used to position systems there. And I think that I wanted to reposition systems in that connecting point, because systems are not always causal. There isn't a linear cause and effect relationship with systems. It's more dispositional, and I wanted to make that point as well. So that's a quick overview of things talked about last time. You can review the recording if you haven't done it up until now. And I won't rehash all those, but I'm going to touch on some of those and then occasionally pause to see if there's comments or questions from anybody that's on the call today. So this is a view of the Cynefin Sense-Making framework. Just to orient everyone, there are systems that are more ordered on the right-hand side. They come in two types. The lower right-hand corner, those that are obvious, where it makes sense, everyone can agree what is the right thing to do, and it's all rational, and they all agree to do it. And then there's some on the upper right-hand corner where it isn't always clear. There is a cause and effect relationship, but you have to have some conversation with experts to figure it out. So you're still working that out. On the left-hand side, the complex realm, a lot of different factors interacting with each other, constantly changing. There's multiple ideas about what's going on, and they're in conflict. And so you don't have the time to decide what is the right thing to do. So the action is to figure out, are there small safe to fail experiments that you can try, interact with the system, see what happens, and see if you can move some things more over to the ordered system. And the lower left-hand corner is the chaos realm, that you can find yourself there if you over-constrain the system, get into a complacency mode, and you find yourself falling off a cliff. Now, as I was contemplating what was going on with this situation we find ourselves in, well, I'll just add some more words here. New terminology that's showing up that I think is beneficial. The word clear being used for this part of the domain down here. Things are clear, confused instead of disordered in the middle. On one side, we're just confused because we don't understand that there's different types of systems at play, and we tend to manage in the way that's most comfortable. And there is another part of that disordered domain called operatic, or based on aporia, which is essentially sort of like I'm trying to figure out what I should do. And so there's a nice summary, again, from Zhen Go from Cognitive Edge that has a nice explanation about that. If you go to that bit.ly link, you can learn more about that. Now, when I think about this situation we find ourselves in this falling off over onto the cliff, as I was interpreting what was going on, and you can view this model at a global level, say looking at the country or looking at the world or looking at an organization or looking at a team or looking at an individual. And I was thinking about what the heck happened that has caused us to get into this situation. And I think about the lemmings jumping off the cliff. And this is my assertion or my suspicion, but at least my interpretation. I think what has happened is we did have some things, or we're trying to have some things in place, call it weak signal detection, to understand the possibility of something like this type of a pandemic that might occur. And weak signal detection, it seems like there were some early signals that were missed or ignored or weren't acted on. And then we didn't really have the systems in place to act accordingly. So we find ourselves in chaos. We find ourselves in this, probably in the disordered domain in the middle, but definitely, falling off into the chaos. And, one thing I'll add to that is, and this too comes from Dave Snowden, who came up with this series of questions that he calls the See, Attend, Act model. Says, so when there's data, do I see the data? Do I pay attention to the data? And will I act on the data? Is really three different processes. And so the sort of the traditional approach is, if we have the right people with the right data, with the right information at the right time, people will make the right choices. And I think what I'm understanding and what others understand is, you have to be able to think about, do I have the systems in place that help people to actually see the data, to actually attend to the data, and to act on the data? And the purpose of this reflection here is not to point blame on any particular person or entity. It's merely my interpretation of how I've taken this all in and thought about where we find ourselves. And in some upcoming slides, I have some ideas about, so if that's true, then what do we do? But I'm going to pause and see if there's any input or questions or comments from anyone that is on the webinar today on this interpretation of, how we found ourselves in this situation.
Mike, Tom Smirtnick. I just want to say thanks for putting these on. I think for me, hearing them more frequently now than I have over the past, say, 6 to 8 months has strangely produced a calming effect for me. So job well done. Calm the chaos, or calm from the chaos, maybe. And I'm starting to gel some more concepts.
Did something happen to your voice, Tom? Your sound?
Can you hear me now or no? No? Hello?
It's not very loud.
Oh, is that any better?
I hear some tweaking going on. Try it again.
Well, that's my earbud speaker volume control I was trying to do. Is that any better? Can you hear me
Okay, there you
now?
go.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was saying your frequent presentation of this material has been calming to me. I'm finding some calm in the chaos. And from the conversation I had with you last about how these concepts, these frameworks could apply to things more industrial, that the world I'm in, not management per se, but some management, data managers, for example, in the big data space. So I just wanted to say thanks. This is very good stuff. I like seeing it over and over, and I hope the other attendees do as well.
Appreciate that. Anyone else?
Yeah, this is Dirk. So can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So on this particular point, so do I see the data? Do I pay attention to the data? Will I act on the data? How does determination of do I have the data that I need? Do I know what data I need in order to make a determination? How does that fit in here?
Well, I think those are all good questions and something we could either unpack in today's discussion or future discussions. I'll make a note of it. I'm going to say a little bit more about that and talk about cognitive processes, the way humans really do make decisions, and that might unpack it a little bit.
Okay.
Great. Anyone else? Okay. So what I want to do is I want to just, again, review some things. This was some of the things I talked about last time. So it isn't just a matter of that we have these different categories of domains, but there's movement between the domains. There's different sort of moves that we can make to try to make sense of things. So some of them include experimenting with ideas, moving from complexity, coming up with multiple parallel safe to fail experiments, some that show some benefit, moving them across. And then you get into more of a linear refinement of an idea that you're going to exploit. And then some things, a few, you decide are going to be put down into that green pattern. There's other patterns that the yellow pattern essentially shows that you occasionally have to periodically go into chaos on purpose to remove constraints and to free up thinking and think about something totally different. And as I said before, we didn't decide to go into chaos. I think we were thrust into chaos. And I think we're being forced to do some things. I'm going to say something about that in a little bit to try to innovate and explore. In that purple pattern, this whole scenario that we find ourselves in, I think, is a good example of constant experimentation and trying to figure out and making adjustments accordingly. So it's becoming a more prevalent pattern. Now, I came across a really good resource. Chris Corrigan, who's one of the folks that contributes at the Cognitive Edge website, has a nice blog post and came up with some things that I found to be beneficial. And in the spirit of sharing, I wanted to forward that to you. So you can go to his blog at that bit.ly link and go to it directly. But relative to the situation we find ourselves in, and examples about, so this is all great theoretical stuff, Mike, but what does it mean in terms of practical applicability? And I think an example of something that should fall into that clear domain is the agreement that everyone should wash their hands often with soap for 20 seconds. It's becoming universally clear that that's one thing that everyone can do. Up in the upper right-hand corner, people find themselves no longer working within an office. They have to figure out how to work remote. Holy cow, I've never done that before. How do I do that? Go to some expertise and try to form a plan and figure out how do I do that. It might be connecting with other people. It might be going to a YouTube video. But anyway, you're trying to figure out a plan, and you need some expertise. So you're in the order domain, but you're trying to figure it out. So in the complex domain, what things can I try? Form some sort of a simple test, see how it works, and then adjust accordingly. My daughter-in-law is a teacher, a high school teacher, but her two kids are also home, so she's teaching and her students through remote location, but she's also locally being the teacher for her kids, as I'm sure is the case for a lot of parents. And she is doing some really interesting things that I see there. And then I'm noticing that when she finds things that seem to be working pretty good, either with her kids remotely or with her kids, my grandchildren locally, she's moving them, between that complex to the liminal zone, working it out, and then be able to make some more of a routine over to the complicated side. And then on the chaotic side, if you find yourself that you are infected, self-quarantining. So in the complex zone, in the chaotic zone is a temporary situation. Pretty soon somebody figures out an action step to try to get out of chaos. And so an example that Chris Corrigan came up with on his blog post that I found beneficial is these are just examples trying to relate it to the situation we find ourselves in. Examples to make this close to home and have it make sense. And in this middle zone, the what used to be disordered, but now comes with the two words there. Dave Snowden has got some really terrific material on his blog post, and there's a bit.ly link to that, so you can read about that there. Expect to be seeing more and more about that, especially as we're trying to find the different paths between, I'm confused or I'm trying to decide what to do, and I think there's some logical guidance that's going to come from that. So I think that's going to be very beneficial. So what I'm going to do next is go through some things that I had planned to do last time. They are related materials to what this is all about. It's related to those domains in the Cynefin Sense-Making framework that I've been talking about. But this gets more to the science of humans and how humans really make decisions. And so thinking about this, if people are familiar with the book, The Invisible Gorilla, there's a bit.ly link on the lower left-hand corner that you can go to that book, a really terrific book. But if you don't know it, the way that humans make decisions, a lot of it has been discovered with some of the work that some cognitive neurosciences have done. And they've done a lot of work with radiologists. So if you're familiar with radiologists, physicians who read x-rays, MRI images, they have a long tradition, many years of education, but also it is a profession that has gone through a long knowledge development period, multiple generations of knowledge development. So a lot of knowledge that's been developed, a lot of dedication to training, a lot of dedication to practice. And so some of the experiments that were run is giving a number of radiologists a number of x-rays and asking them to look for anomalies, which is essentially what they do. They're looking at x-rays, looking for anomalies and seeing what they can find. On one of the x-rays, they put an image of a gorilla that is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule. 83% of the 83% of the radiologists who looked at that did not see it. 17% did, but if that 17% talked to the 83%, they could be convinced that they were in error. So this is important information to know about how humans make decisions. If you don't know, in Anglo-Saxon languages, we see 5% of what we scan. If you're Chinese, it goes up to 10%, and it has to do with a different way that the language is based upon visual constructs that develop. But anyway, we see 5% of what we scan at the most. Usually it may be around 2 to 3. So looking around the room, looking around the computer screen that you're looking at, the most that we take in is going to be at maximum 5% of what we scan. What we then do with what we take in, we do conceptual blending. So what we do notice, we blend with our past history, our the stories we heard from others, the stories we hear from colleagues, the things that are most recent to us, the things that are most recent in experience on the brain, the things that we've experienced most recently. We combine it with that, and then we make a decision. So we make a first fit pattern match, not a best fit pattern match. We don't look at all the data. We don't do that. And if you understand human evolution, you can understand why. Because we evolved as essentially packs or clans of people to be able to take in information very quickly to decide what to do for survival's sake. And if we saw animals, say our predecessors saw animals out on the horizon, we wouldn't stop to try to do a research of all of the animals that are available on the veldt of Africa, and then decide what to do and match it against, oh, that's a lion. Well, here's what we should do with a lion. By that time, we would not be surviving. So we develop these heuristics, which are essentially useful shortcuts that help us to maximize the energy to be able to make the right decisions. Unfortunately, though, that results in inattentional blindness. So we do not see what we don't expect to see. And the point I was making, we evolved to make decisions very quickly. We make decisions in groups, not as individuals. And the final point I want to make on this is not a condition that you can fix through training. This is a condition that needs to be understood and then worked through. And it has all sorts of implications as far as scanning, getting a lot of different viewpoints, trying to find the 17% who see things different and listening to what they have to say, because they might help us to not fall off the cliff. They might help us to see what's really going on and to try to understand that, and to do the type of scanning that needs to be scanned is going to be very important. So that's just one point I want to make on this. I'm going to pause and see, are there any comments or questions on that particular point I wanted to convey, how humans make decisions? If it makes sense, I'll move on. Okay, so another challenge we have is humans confuse causation with correlation. So what does this mean? I like these examples that Dave provides. There's a website that shows a lot of these correlations. If you don't know it, if you look at the Nobel Prize winners per population, per head count in different countries, and you correlate it with chocolate consumption, you can get a nice graph that looks like this. And then the conclusion is well, if we want to have more Nobel Prizes in our country, we should have people eating more dark chocolate. So the solution is, let's eat more dark chocolate. And another one is that they looked at the number of people that drowned by falling into swimming pools, and the number of films that where Nicolas Cage was in that were released, and they said, oh, well, look at that, there's a correlation. So there must be something to that. And as I said, there's a website. I didn't include the link here, but I can put it out there in the notes. So people confuse causation with correlation. Now, this can be all kind of funny and silly, but it becomes very important when you take a review of the books that you've purchased, and I've done this and gone through it many times, and reviewing the business books that you find in your library. And many of these business books are based upon some false assumptions about things they've noticed with some cases of some companies that looked like they did things well, and it was purported that if you do these things, you'll do things well as well. There's another category of books. I won't mention titles, but if anybody wants to talk about it offline, I'm happy to share. So one category of books looking at a number of cases and discerning some sort of a recipe, and based upon that, telling people that if you follow this recipe, you too will be successful. The other category is people have an idea about the way companies should be or the way people should be, and they find cases that match their thesis, and they share that in their book, and they don't take the time to share those that don't fit that pattern. So what's going on here is that in those situations where those successful books were sold and people bought a lot of copies of them, what they didn't realize was that they chose examples that were the dominant, called the apex predator example. So the dominant industry, a lot of the companies that were on the surge as far as moving into a new industry, they took examples from those, not realizing that many of those that didn't succeed did the exact same thing. So we talked about this in one of our white papers using this S-curve example. Then the bit.ly link to that white paper can be found there. But I put this out there as a caution because we do seem to, as a human, as a species, have this inclination to try to find causation when it really isn't there. And so we have to be careful of that. And it becomes very important because there are a lot of books and people giving advice out there that you really have to use this knowledge as a filter to discern, is this really something that's worth looking into, or is it possibly, am I falling into a trap of something that is based upon some misunderstanding between causation and correlation? So I'm going to pause and see any questions about that concept. Okay, moving on. So there's some other things to think about and know about relative to this case-based approach, finding cases, coming up with a thesis, and then purporting that that is going to be the way to go to be successful as well. And again, this too comes from Dave Snowden and the people at Cognitive Edge. And so there's 3 different effects that they talk about. So one is called the Cobra effect. The English in India years ago decided that there were too many cobras and they needed to do something about that. So they gave a reward of 1 rupee per cobra head if people would go kill some cobras and bring in the heads. They would then be given a rupee money, and it became lucrative. And so people developed cobra farms where they were actually growing rupees, growing cobras. They were growing rupees too, because people were getting rich off of this thing. But the original problem was too many cobras, but this was producing way too many cobras in these cobra farms. And so the English shut down the program, and then people released all the cobras, and then they had even more of a problem than they did before. So this is an example of where somebody goes to a conference, goes to some sort of a program, sees something that someone else did, and then tries to introduce it into their program, and they don't fully understand how it works, or that it only worked in those situations but didn't understand the limitations of how it works. And you also see this in companies where people broadcast, we now have a new change initiative, we're going to be pursuing these particular things, and we need you to use these values, and everyone should have these values. And what they don't realize is people just see this, see right through it, and they unpack what they used to be talking about, search and find, and replace what they used to put on their PowerPoint slides with the new language that corporate wants to hear, and then the new stuff shows up, and then it shows the same effect. So that's one example. Another effect is called the Hawthorne effect. Now, this is based upon cable manufacturer. If you go to Wikipedia, you can learn all about this. In the early 1900s, studying the scientific management, they wanted to understand productivity, what improved productivity, so they increased the lighting in the plant, and productivity improved. And being good scientists, they did the opposite. They turned the lighting down, and lo and behold, productivity improved. So it wasn't so much the lighting, it was doing something novel and paying attention to it. Now, this becomes important when people want to try something that they've been told will work, or they develop a pilot program and they give it attention and it seems to work, and then they try to spread it into other areas. And what they don't understand is it wasn't the actual method or approach that they were doing, it was the fact they were giving something attention, that people were producing something better, and it was because it was novel and they were getting attention. So they didn't fully understand that Hawthorne effect. And the third effect is called the butterfly effect. You might have heard about this in chaos and complexity literature. The idea is that a butterfly flaps its wings in the Amazon, and then that produces a hurricane in Texas. But that's a very simple explanation for what it was intended to really show, which was many small things occurring can combine with other small effects that are occurring, and they can produce a larger outcome, a larger result. But what they don't understand is the likelihood that you would be able to get those combinations to occur again are very small. So the things that came together that allowed Apple as a company to be successful, or Google to be successful, aren't going to happen again. All of those little conditions, those small conditions that came together surreptitiously to produce the outcome that did, to try to imitate that is going to be a fool's errand, because people don't understand the limitation of trying to trace back and understand what those causal factors were. So case-based approach, again, some limitations to that. And I think we fall prey to this all the time when people have cases, they want to study cases about what works, and they don't understand the limitations of it. So I'm going to pause on that point before I get into the next point and see if there's any questions or comments. Courteous group today. Okay, this next point has to do with understanding the difference between somebody who follows a recipe and a chef. So most anyone can follow a recipe, even I can follow a recipe, but if you have something unexpected that happens, you're out of an ingredient, or you don't have the exact right ingredient, or you don't have the same sort of equipment that is called for in the recipe, you get into a problem because you're no longer in that ordered domain. You're now into something that is unexpected, and you don't know what to do. And that is the difference between somebody that is merely following a recipe and someone that has taken time and developed knowledge over time to go from understanding what needs to happen, say for a certain meal, but has developed the theory of taste and understands, and they can make a good meal out of anything that you have in your kitchen. And that is not an easy thing to do, and it isn't something that can be conveyed or developed in the short term. It takes years and years for this to happen. So I recently blogged about this, and you can go to that bit.ly link to see what I wrote about this. But we also wrote about this in one of our white papers called Practical Wisdom. And I wanted to connect some of the things that's in that white paper to this idea about we need more chefs or generalists and less recipe followers, or specialists. So in this paper, we talked about there's different types of problems that you come across Some are of more of a convergent nature, left-hand side. Some are more of a divergent nature, right-hand side. So an example of the left-hand side of problem A, here's an example of a convergent type problem. So if I give you a square, and there's a square, and I ask you, please make a square that's got twice the area of that square, could you do it? And some people would try, and they would try to figure it out, and they'd sort it out. But I can also give you the solution. I could say, take the diagonal of that square. Now that becomes the side of a new square. Create a new square, and that square has twice the area of that square that you originally had. And why is that a problem that's over here? It's problem A, it's convergent, because I can give you the solution, and you don't have to go through the intellectual effort to figure out why it worked. You just have to know that if you follow these steps, it will work. And you can be highly confident that you're going to get the same result. So that's problem A. That's going to be a predictable type of problem compared to the unpredictable over on the divergent side. So problem B, moving slightly over to the right, if I've got some sort of a pillar here and I've got, let's say, a bowling ball on the top, and I shove it off, the question is, how fast is it going when it reaches its terminal velocity? Well, this too, I can plug in a formula if I know the formula and can do the math, and I can do the calculation, and I can come up with the answer. But the reasons it's moved over to the right a little bit is because I'm no longer working in the abstract. I'm working in the material world. Something may come along and actually cause that ball not to hit the ground. Some element of the real world may occur, and it may not always be possible. Now, going to problem C, and then I want to go back to this notion of cooking. If problem C is to bake 2 loaves of bread, you can follow the recipe, and we could all be using the same recipe book, and you could make reasonably good bread. But the problem is there's environmental conditions, and also the ability of the baker comes into play. So now we have a human element. So different altitudes, different sorts of situations. I've got to know all those. I have to understand how they interact, and I have to go from the skill of being able to follow a recipe to the art of being able to bake, and that takes a long time. And problem D, the example that we use in our white paper is to educate a child at the turn of the century, or now in this day and age, to be an informed critical thinking. Well, there's no way that there's going to be any sort of a recipe that I can give that is going to be able to be the answer to that. And so the best you can do is try to balance the opposites of trying to encourage kids to explore new ideas, new things without being too headstrong, and trying to point them down a certain path. Allow them to explore and be what they want to be, and that's an example of a more of a divergent type situation. What I haven't done is overlaid this particular model with the Cynefin Sense-Making model, and I can see that that might be something that would be beneficial. But anyway, I just wanted to unpack that as something, as an example of we need more recipe, or we need more chefs, less recipe followers, and developing that knowledge and transferring that knowledge is a lot more than just codifying it and writing it down and telling people to write down what they know. And I have an upcoming slide on that as well. So as I did in the past, I'm going to pause and see if there's any questions on this particular comment as well. I see a comment here. Okay. All right. I'm going to proceed. Again, read more about that in that book, Practical Wisdom. So another point to make is this idea that we need to stop trying to change people. So I also recently blogged about this. You can go to that bit.ly link and blog about this. There is a strong dominant view that the focus should be changing the individual or working on the individual. Encourage people to be of a certain type, and that's a problem. an interesting anecdote and some research that Dave Snowden actually did. He showed that astrology is actually a stronger predictor of team behavior than Myers-Briggs, and pointed out that there isn't a lot of validity to that type of a personality test as a predictor of team behavior. Yet many people continue to use personality tests like Myers-Briggs and others with the idea that we should be focusing on trying to change the individual to have certain competencies, and if only those people have those competencies, would they be able to um, to be successful. So there's a big problem with that. One way that I think about this is any individual interacts with multiple systems, and we need to think more about what is the impact that those systems have on the individual, but also the interactions between individuals. We're going to be much more successful to think about how do we change and improve the interactions, and spending less time trying to change people, because it isn't going to work. That's not the way that change comes about. It's going to be through thinking about the systems, the environments, and the interactions between people that are going to cause people to act differently. And I think that's a more beneficial way to go. So I'm going to say something here about lessons. So take any team that is working on some sort of a project or approach, and ask them about why they were successful, or lessons learned along the way. Maybe that's a good way to put it. Let's talk about lessons learned. So after the project, they have a retrospective study of let's capture our lessons learned. It's a very common approach. The problem is the stories that people tell are going to be different based upon whether they were successful in their effort or if they failed in their effort. And people develop retrospective coherence about to explain what happened based upon the political realities of the present. A better way to do it is to get lessons learned along the way, for people to capture everyday occurrences about what they're learning, as opposed to doing a retrospective review of what's going on. You're going to get a much more beneficial and reality-based view about what really does work, what doesn't work. So another thing about lessons for people that have kids, or if you were a kid, if you recall bedtime stories, the bedtime stories that were told were about things that could occur if kids didn't follow the rules. And so here's Hansel and Gretel. What happened to them? Well, bad things happened to them. But at the end of the story, it all ends out well because we want to sleep at night. And so the lessons learned, starting with childhood, we learn a lot more from failure stories, from things that don't work, things that we want to avoid, than lessons that do work. So people talk about best case practices. We need to capture best practice cases and share those. Actually, the stories that work to produce results in an organization are the stories of failure, the stories about when it didn't work out well, what we learned from trying to avoid that, and we need to try to um, uh, understand the power of the negative stories to say, here's what we don't want, and then we can actually have people explore and produce more of what we do want. So we have to understand the powers of, call it worst case stories. And if anybody is a Star Trek fan, you might recognize this image. And this has to do with lessons learned and teaching teams about problem solving. So in this particular story in Star Trek, the Kobayashi Maru, the team was given a challenge, and it was a no-win scenario that it was designed to cause you to fail. And in team learning sessions where the participants are actually sort of set up to fail, there's actually much more scanning that occurs of data and information. So training people and building in failure points along the way actually causes people to be much better scanners of the information, much better ability to include others into the decision making, and you get a much better result. So just like last time, I got close to the end of the hour, and I'm going to jump to the end here and then shut this down. But I will stay online if anybody wants just to chat. I did see a note here from Dirk that he's got to move on, so appreciate that. So again, a lot of what I'm sharing are things that I've learned and tried to integrate it with the things that we talk about here at IEX. So what's going to happen next is the recording to this webinar will be available for others, either yourself or from people that you would like to share this with. Jason Schulist needed to postpone this webinar for a later date, and so we're going to do that. I do have Brooks Carter has agreed on April 23rd to do another webinar or a webinar for us on gratitude. And I think that is also something that's going to help people in a very meaningful way through this time period that we're dealing with. And what I will be doing is, revisiting some of the topics that I haven't been yet talking about, and we'll be packaging probably a series of webinars, just helping people to connect with and understand how this knowledge, understanding complexity and understanding getting out of chaos, giving them some ideas and also paths forward to navigate out of this situation and find themselves in with the pandemic situation. We have produced a podcast, and Max Brown is leading that up. So if you go to our website and you go to podcasts, you can view the recordings that Max is making there on his podcast, and he's getting a lot of participation in that. And of course, a lot of the topics are around helping people, sharing their advice around the pandemic situation. So if you have any ideas, or if you like the idea of further discussion around this topic, I'd be happy to put something together. I had some conversations with folks last time after last time's webinar, and we'll be following up with them as well. And so I would put that out there as something I'm willing to do. With 3 minutes left, I'm going to push the pause button on the recording. But before I do that, I just want to, one last time, see if there's any questions or comments from anyone in the group. And as I said, I'm going to hang on if anybody just wants to chat or hang out. Okay, I saved you all some time. You've got a few more minutes before the next thing you've got to do. Hope everyone stays safe. Hope you found benefit from this webinar. And as I said before, I'm going to push pause on the recording. And if anybody just wants to hang out and chat, if they've got the time, I'd be willing to do that. So thanks and have a good day. Stay safe. Be nice to each other.